Welcome to the You Matter podcast, where we host interesting people and have enlightening conversations. My name is Ned Burwell, and I'll be your host. Hello, everybody. I have Al Lauzon with me here today. I've been chomping at the bit to interview this guy. We've met up a few times and had some great conversations. So Al is a retired professor from the University of Guelph. He has degrees in psychology, extension education, adult education, and community development. So in his retirement, I don't think moss is going to grow on his feet. He continues to write on foundational issues ranging from issues related to technology, education, spirituality, and sustainability. Al also writes about the human journey, and in particular, the evolution of human consciousness. Al sees that we need a new mode of being in the world, a new world view, and in his explorations of this new need is the argument that we're moving toward a participatory worldview. Over the years, he's been involved in numerous projects that focus on rural change and development. This includes rural healthcare, innovation, rural youth, food security, rural education, and precarious employment, to name a few. He has several publications that can often be found sitting on many different boards that affect community well-being. I'm almost positive that I haven't done this bio complete or as I should, but and on a personal level, I find you to be so interesting and inspiring. Whenever I see one of your social media posts come up, I tend to take note and say, okay, what's Al saying today?
God forbid.
But I really do. And I find that sometimes people don't challenge me that much. And I find that your work just sometimes it's such little words that you say that it impacts me and makes me think throughout the day. So I appreciate that a lot, Al. So when I was looking at your social media, I came up with this quote and I put it on my Facebook. I don't know if you caught it, but the quote was sort of inspired by you. And the quote reads, "When I look at the broken bones of society, I see healing and growth, not devastation. I see hope in the rise of a greater world for us all to live in." So I'd like to speak about the broken bones today. Yeah. But most importantly, I want to talk about healing growth in this new world that we see rising. You know, when I look across your work, I see a person who is determined to make an impact. And I think a lot of the work that you've done throughout the years, I'm sure, has made such a significant impact. So I want to start with talking just a little bit about you. What is your motivation for all your work experiences and things that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I've always... So there's two components. There's a personal component of me and my own personal experience and sort of my subjective experience. And then there's my professional component. And they really sort of merge together. And really the work that I've done is really informed by a desire to understand what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And really trying to make sense of it. And figure out where we're going, where we've been, because part of what I've learned through the process is that we need to understand where we've been in order to understand where we're going. Mm-hmm. And the work that you talk about, sort of the work around consciousness and soul and spirituality, really, I've been at that work now since 1990. Yeah. Just thinking about it and sort of pursuing it and trying to deepen my own understanding of where we are collectively. And I think in deepening my own work or deepening my understanding of where we're going collectively, I also understand my own story better. Mm-hmm. and my own evolution and development and how that exists with the sort of the larger interface, I guess, if I can put it that way, with the collective movement. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and I found that so fascinating when the first time you told me that you've been doing consciousness studies for years and years, like alarms went off in my mind. It's like, okay, let's put questions of this guy. And yeah, so I can see evidence of that with the way that you present yourself through your life and the work that you're doing. So if we look out into the world, we see we're sort of in this mental health crisis, and there's people that are lost in the world. Now, I'd like to share a little bit about my thoughts about being lost. I think, because people sometimes will come to me and say, Ned, I feel so lost right now. And the first thing that happens in my mind is like, good, this is great. This is a really good thing. Not so much for them. It doesn't feel good, but maybe it is good. So when we get lost, it sort of causes us to question.
Yeah.
It causes us to seek answers that only we can answer within ourselves, or maybe we go outward and seek those answers as well. But I think the deeper answers that we get and that help us grow and move, because being lost has helped me grow and move, they come from deep within. And so the society that's a little lost, I think, is going to start going in a much better direction. So what do you think about this mental health crisis that we've been in, and what can we do to help as an individual?
Well, I definitely think we're in a mental health crisis, and in particular with youth and young people, but also with older people. And I think people are experiencing a sense of loss. They're experiencing a loss of stability. Mm-hmm. They're experiencing a loss of meaning. The institutions that we've often found comfort in seem to be increasingly dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And so people are lost. They don't know where to turn to. And really what it gets down to is a loss of meaning. And so one of the things that differentiates us from most of the other creatures in the creation is our need for meaning. We need to have meaningful lives. And when we don't have meaningful lives, then there's an emptiness that comes with that. And I think there's also what's the word I'm looking for? I guess it's just an emptiness. There's this emptiness, and so what does it matter? Mm-hmm. And there's a loss of hope. There's a loss of faith, and I'm not using faith necessarily in a religious context, but a loss of faith in the world and in people, mm-hmm. and not being able to find our way or even knowing what our way is anymore. I think what people really need to, and you said, what you said really resonates with me. I often talk to people about issues around mental health and how do we sort of help people. And I'm personally of the opinion that the last thing they need is our advice.
Oh, yeah.
People need to resolve it. So what they really need is somebody to listen to them. And sometimes we need to say things out loud so that we don't keep chasing them around in our head. Mm. And so I think listening becomes really good, of being present to people who are suffering, and all of us suffer on some degree. I always say nobody gets out of life unscathed. Yeah. And so we all suffer in some form. But I think in that suffering, and this is what you were talking about when I think you said, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is that it presents a new opportunity to grow and learn to be in the world in a different way.
That's right.
And in that world, and coming into that, being different in the world than you were, also comes with the meaning. Meaning comes with that. So as you rediscover who you are, and I think one of the things that's sort of very cliche is that we will die many times over the course of our life, and it's that cycle of sort of birth, death, and rebirth. That's really important. And so it is a good thing sometimes that we are suffering, because that's just part of the human condition. And it's okay. It's okay. It's not comfortable.
No.
It's very uncomfortable. And in times when we're going through sort of a collective change too, really creates conditions that are anxiety producing. That lead to things like depression and suicidal ideation. And that's sort of what's the point. And so I think we need to understand too that mental health crisis is embedded in a cultural crisis also.
Okay.
And that cultural crisis is really about moving to a different way of collectively of being in the world. And I think this gets back to a lot of your work that you talk about, Ned, around sort of healing in that. We have individual healing to do, but we also have collective healing to do. And right now we're in, we talk about, or we could talk about liminal space. And really it's liminal space is a space between one way of being in the world and an emergent. So an ending way of being in the world and an emerging way of being in the world. And there was a psychologist, William Bridges, who talked about transitions, endings, beginnings. But what I really keyed in on him was when he talked about the neutral zone. And he has a phrase that I just love. The neutral zone is characterized by, how did he put it?
Attentive inactivity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a brilliant phrase, and it really describes that liminal space. But liminal space is scary because we're giving up what we know for what we don't know.
That's right.
And so that's where faith and hope, I think, really begins to come in, that we have to have hope. We have to have faith that things can be better.
That's right.
And we have to have hope. But hope is an action. It's not simply a wish or a thought. Hope requires that we actually exercise our agency in the world to bring about the changes that we desire to bring about.
That's right.
And so I think, hope gets a bad rap sometimes because just saying, I just hope things get better. Well, they're not going to get better unless you actually do something. I put actually a cartoon up on social media today that came across mine with a bunch of people, and the guy asks, who wants change? And everybody puts up their hand, and then he says, who wants to change? And nobody puts up their hand, And I thought that's a really good characterization. Everybody wants to change things, but they don't want to change. And we actually don't have any choice around change right now. I don't think we ever have choice of change, or we don't have the choice of not changing.
That's right.
So we're in a constant state of evolution, both personally and collectively. And so my own work then is situated on wanting to understand the human journey as a species, and how we've changed over time. Yeah. And what we're going through, the discord that we're going through right now, is a discord that's been actually repeated by numerous cultural shifts across the history of the human species.
Okay.
It's always a time of death that will lead to rebirth. And so, it's kind of like the phoenix will rise out of the ashes of what was.
That's right.
Something will be new. So it's both terrifying and exciting.
Well, it's terrifying for the mind because the mind likes to weigh, measure, calculate, stay steadfast in its assumptions. And so, I've read a lot of some of Williams Bridges' work as well. And I find it so fascinating that we are in that time of transition still, and what will be is not here. What was no longer is. Yeah. And that piece of attentive inactivity is such a crucial point. And I've shared this with a few of my friends.
Okay.
In the last maybe 2 years, I've been talking to different people about that topic. And when you tell somebody it's a time to be attentive, just watch, do nothing. You don't have to do anything. It sort of is kind of a relief to say, okay, my job's just to watch right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's stellar advice for people that are feeling a lot of stress over the changes that they see, but no ability to, or not feeling like they can make anything positive changes to make this world a better place. But we are in that transitional time.
Yeah, and you're right. It just requires a sitting with sometimes. There's a psychiatrist by the name of Diekman. He talks about the observing self and our capacity to step outside ourselves in order to watch ourselves. I think is a really important quality to have. And I think too, when we're faced with this type of uncertainty, when I think about it, I think of 3 responses to it. So the first response to sort of this notion of change that we're going through is let's go back to the way it used to be. The idea of going back to the good old days. Well, you know what? The good old days weren't so good for everybody.
That's right.
If you're old and white and male, they were good days. Mm-hmm. But for everybody else, not so hot.
That's right.
So, and we see a lot of that being played out now in Western culture. The second response is, we just need to keep going the way that we are, and technology will solve everything. Mm-hmm. No, that's not going to happen. And some of the proposed technology around things like geoengineering scares the bejesus out of me. Mm-hmm. And then there's that creative element, and that's where we really need to be. And creativity arises as a result of that capacity to sit with it.
That's right.
And out of that emerges new understandings, new ways. And you said a key word there, assumptions. And that's what we're talking about, is changing our fundamental assumptions about the way the world works and about the way that we work in the world.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult for people to do sometimes, first of all, to recognize the assumptions that they operate on. And then to say, you want me to give those up? Mm-hmm. But we don't have a choice. We have to give them up. Things aren't working well for the human species at this moment, at least in my opinion. But that's okay. It's okay because it's an indicator of the change that's coming, or the change that needs to come.
That's right.
And it's very challenging times that we live in, and very, like you say, scary times and hopeful times. I think the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
We definitely live in interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings me to, as I was digging into the world of Al that's online, I found 2 quotes on your social media that I really admire and caused me to look inward. So the first quote: "To live at the end of times is to live at the beginning of times, should we choose to begin anew. And this is the cause for hope." So that I just resonated with so deeply. And then the second quote, it's a little longer here: "We're now witnessing the demise of one story, modernity." Say that again? Modernity. Okay. "But hope is found in the emergence of a new story, one that will arise from the ashes of the old story, one that's more inclusive and includes all people and all life, a story that is global in perspective and scope. Our stories, as they evolve, each adhere to developmental logic, whereby each emergent story is both more inclusive and more complex. Such is the human journey, and our time here, merely one of many cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. This has been characterized by the human species' journey, whereby the world is restored. This process should give us hope." And then I really like that idea of the world being restored. I find that stimulating. Now, if I have a very limited understanding of our history, but when I look back at some of the history, I do see a new world being jockeyed throughout after so many decades or centuries. There's always a rise of a new world being spoke of. And I think that it's innately part of our human nature to look at where we're at and imagine something greater. So when I read those 2 quotes, any additional thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's usually individuals that are sort of at the forefront of something. And a lot of my doctoral work that I did in terms of my dissertation back in the 90s actually dealt with these types of issues. And so I always use the quote. I knew I'd have to go back in history. I just didn't realize I'd have to go back in history till, humans stood up on 2 feet on the African savanna to really understand the human journey. Yeah. But even if you go back to the emergence of, the modern state, which is really a product of the scientific and industrial revolutions and the democratic revolutions and that period, prior to that, there was sort of a theological worldview that the church dominated, particularly the Catholic Church. And there were people who resisted that, and they were resisting that based on their experience, going, this doesn't jive with my experience. So, you have, the big people like Newton and Descartes and Bacon, who really challenged the status quo. You have Galileo, who was imprisoned for the rest of his life as a result of challenging that. But what they were really doing, and it's interesting, they were really making an argument about going back to my own experience, starting with my own experience, and rather than accepting the doctrine of the church at the time. Mm-hmm. We see a parallel, or I should say, a parallel period starting in the 60s in Western culture. Okay. You have the rise of the environmental movement. You have the second wave of feminism. You have the rise of the anti-war movement. You have civil rights coming in. And so there's a lot of contesting of authority. Mm. And that's usually what sort of brings about change when we look back, is the authority of the day is contested by individuals who say, this doesn't work for me. Mm. And we need to change things so that it works better for me. And I think we see that even today, LGBTQ rights and these things, and I know a lot of people have problems with that, and there's a backlash to that. But the backlash comes as a result of existing authority being challenged. Mm. And so I think it's a really interesting time for that. So, but if we challenge authority, what are we doing? And what's interesting about those movements, too, is that they go back to their experience. The second wave of feminism really arose out of women's experience of a patriarchal society. And I always go back to, I don't always go back, but Riane Eisler's work. Have you ever heard of her? And she wrote a book back in the 80s called The Chalice and the Blade. Okay. And she talks about the dynamics between the matriarchy and the patriarchy, and the matriarchy is characterized by the chalice. Patriarchy is characterized by the blade, and the blade actually exerted. There was a patriarchy, and that goes back to the earth goddesses. If you remember those statues of those very sort of robust-looking, faceless women, mm-hmm. That were really an expression of that time. And so it's at that time that patriarchy really emerges and has dominated since then. And I actually think, and we'll probably get into that, but the whole feminine masculine thing, mm-hmm. I think really gets into play. So you had mentioned sort of the notion of participatory. Mm-hmm.
And that participatory piece, I found that really interesting, of this new world that we need to participate. Yeah, expand on that.
Okay. So actually, it's really about participatory consciousness, and that's been written about by a Polish philosopher called Skolimowski. Okay. And he wrote about participatory consciousness. And when I first read him, it really clicked for me that we're actually moving in this direction. There's a greater need for people to be engaged. Mm. The rise of civil society, the work that you do out in the community. So you're not paid to do work out in the community per se. You do it because you're engaged with the community. Yeah. And we require greater engagement. Democracy is not something that happens when we vote. Democracy is how we choose to live our life and contribute on a daily, ongoing basis. Yeah. And so participatory consciousness is really a recognition of the need for humans to be fully engaged with the world and with other people. Mm-hmm. The solutions to some of the things. So one of the arguments I would make that participatory consciousness is really important is things that happen at the local level. So participatory needs to be localized. It needs to be influenced. I often go back to the Buddhist sort of saying, if everybody swept the street in front of their house, the streets would always be clean, mm-hmm. rather than, well, we're waiting for the street cleaners to come.
That's right.
We can't wait for the street cleaners to come anymore. One of the things that when I was teaching, I used to tell students all time, can't wait for government anymore. We need to be engaged. We need to be actively working towards the world that we want to create, and that requires our engagement, which goes back to that issues around mental health, around exercising our agency and becoming engaged. And I think one of the, I can remember years ago, Ned, there was a restaurant in Toronto that I had dinner at. They made a fantastic curry, but it was called the Raging Spoon.
Okay.
And it was populated, it was all the employees were ex-patients of Queen Street Mental Health Center.
Okay.
And it gave them meaning, it gave them purpose, it gave them a reason for being. In that restaurant, I don't know if it still exists, but it was incredibly successful. And the food was just phenomenal. But how do we create the conditions for engagement? And I think, to go back to youth and mental health, youth are disengaged, so they find dysfunctional ways of engaging. And I'll be honest, I have a bias against social media. I think social media has been, all technology enhances our well-being at the same time that there's a shadow side to it.
That's right.
That undermines our well-being. And we've really seen the shadow side of social media, I think, through a variety of different forms. And people need real engagement. They need to sit face to face. There's an energetic exchange that happens that doesn't happen in social media. Plus, social media.
It's that stop-start communication. It doesn't help you learn how to draw a conversation from deeper within.
Yeah. Well, I have a really good friend, and one of the things that she says, and she doesn't like social media at all, she said, I read people's profiles and I feel bad because they're living these lives. But the lives they're living are not the lives that are necessarily presented on social media. So even sort of that technological piece, I think we need to sort of rethink. AI scares me.
Yeah, I think you and a lot of people.
Yeah, and for a variety of different reasons. But, it's kind of feels like letting the genie out of the bottle. And once you let the genie out, you can't get the genie back in.
Yeah.
And so we have we have technology, we have global climate change, we have increasing inequality, we have homelessness, we have people, increasing food insecurity. And so part of it is you have to ask, and part of the challenge is we often silo these things. So we think, food insecurity or homelessness or whatever. They're related. And they really relate back to when we were talking about those assumptions that we have. So what do we need to reclaim? And I like your work because you talk a lot about the soul. The soul is absolutely fundamental. The soul is where we derive our meaning from. In the depth psychology literature, they'll talk about sort of logos, which is really the mind, the rational mind, and mythos, which is really about myth and story. And that's one of the things that I think you talked about. You like that restoring idea. Even in scholarly work and in the academy now, we see an increasing emphasis on story as opposed to theory.
That's right.
And story touches people in ways that they can relate to. It affects them emotionally. It affects them spiritually. And so when we want to communicate, particularly sort of soul to soul, the soul talks in stories.
Yeah.
Doesn't talk in theories. And that's comes back to that finding that balance. Do we still need the mind? Yes, we still need the mind.
The tool.
It's a partner with the soul in some ways. And so it serves a function, but it can't be the dominant function. And so, that you talk a lot about the divinity, and you call it God, I think, but I call it the creator, or the power of creation that permeates everything. And that leads back to us also interacting with other life forms, other creatures, including them in our assumptions and visions and and that. And so, whether that's a form of panpsychism where, the divine exists within everything.
That's right.
And is expressed within everything. I think part of the attraction these days to indigenous worldviews is that, from my perspective anyways, indigenous worldviews are rooted in soul. Mm-hmm. They're not rooted simply in the mind, the rational mind. Mm-hmm. And, we talk about rationality and irrationality, but there's irrationality too, which is the realm of the soul.
Okay.
So, intuition is a powerful way of knowing, and can provide insight. And intuition is related back to notions of creativity, and it's creativity that we need right now. Mm-hmm. It's not the rational mind. We need people creative. And that's why people like yourself, who are artists and authors, are so incredibly important to where we're at historically. Scientists less important than artists and writers and authors, people with vision, who can see alternatives and can present alternatives, I think become incredibly important, even though within the existing power structure, they're often devalued. But they're also at the margins. And that's one of the things when we're talking about sort of this big shift that we're going through, is that change never comes from the center. It comes from the margins.
Okay.
And so it's those people who exist on the margins who have the capacity to begin to bring about the change in the center. And the change in the center is dominated by the powerful. And if we look across the world now, that center gets smaller and smaller and is dominated by fewer and fewer people.
Yeah.
Anyways, now I'm rambling, Ned. So
no, but I see, like, as you've inched your way through this conversation, participatory. I stumble with words so frequently.
Participatory consciousness.
And a lot of this I won't edit out. I just allow my stumbles. Consciousness. So I see that's sort of the starting point. It's like what that does is it makes us focus, look at what's around us, become aware, and then we start to build connections with other people. What can I do? Well, it's in front of us. It's always coming to us. We don't have to try to figure it out in our minds. What we need to do is always at our feet. So you went there, and then through that we begin to connect more. So if I see you and you're in need of something, or just make an observation how your life's changed and speak to you about that, we build a connection. That connection we build ensues a deeper understanding of ourselves, connecting with other, which draws us into the depths of our soul. We get to the soul, we get to creativity. Because that's the source of creativity, is it lives within that darkness of the soul. And and I've spoke about this last time we met. It's in that darkness, and it's where the light gathers, that darkness. And so as you moved your way through that conversation, it was instructions for how to participate, and then what comes next after we learn how to participate in this world. And I agree, we need the mind, but we can't live there. No. We sort of have to kind of re-engage what's around us. And you take that back to William Bridges. Attentive inactivity. But as soon as you draw in enough, then it's time to act.
You remind me, and I'll just share experience back when I was doing my doctoral work. And one of the classes I did, we did a lot of guided imagery. And this one day the person took us on a journey with community, and people had bridges and joints and that. But what came to me in my mind is I saw these little pinpoints of light. Mm-hmm. And these pinpoints of light started sending out shoots that connected with other pinpoints of light. And when they connected with another pinpoint of light, they began to become brighter and brighter and continued to send out these shoots till all that was there was this glowing globe. And it really, I think when you said about sort of reaching out and connecting with others, that's really powerful. And we can only know ourselves in relationship whether that's relationship to the larger creation, relationship to, people, relationship to our partner or our children. They're the mirrors that reflect back to us who we are. And I think that's really, really key. But I also like the idea that you were talking about, sort of the light and the dark. And I think about our culture, because we rarely actually live in the dark in Western culture. We have lights to light up the dark. And as a result, we fear the dark.
Yeah.
Rather than being comfortable in the dark. And again, that gets back to sort of the rhythm of life between light and dark. And I can remember writing a poem years ago about that, and about the darkness sort of settling in, and the fear and the voices that you hear in the darkness. And then the light comes into the day, and you try to escape, and you realize that escape's only possible in the darkness, not in the light. And I think that really resonates. What you said really resonates, I think, with that sort of notion of darkness and creativity and soul. The soul does sit in the dark often. And so, yeah, I think that's very powerful. It's interesting in the last 10 or 15 years that soul, I think I wrote my first article on soul in 1998.
Okay.
And it was called Psychology of the Soul. And really, that's where I spend most of my time now in terms of my own ongoing learning. I'm reading somebody, Michael Mead, who's really quite fascinating. And this notion of soul and spirit. And soul and spirit come together, The spirit has the capacity to fly. Soul has, the capacity to ground. I think it was sort of a New Age saying that, sort of going back years ago, that, sort of wholeness comes while you fly amongst the stars with your feet firmly planted upon the ground.
Yeah.
And I think that really is sort of the poles of the human experience. Anyway.
I talk about the layers of the soul and break it down through states of consciousness.
Yeah.
And I wrote about that in my book, Awakened, the Reality of What Is. I don't know if you've read through that, those chapters, and I find it interesting to look at what is the soul, and how do we understand that, so that we sort of unwrap this egoic sense of self and let that component of who we really are shine forth into the world. And that's sort of my work, is how much of me can I unwrap that's just an elaborate costume that I wear.
Well, it's interesting that you raise that, and I think about your journey, or at least what I know about your journey, and I know about my journey. And the emergence of soul often seems to me to happen after re-experiencing and dealing with trauma in your life. And so it creates, it's sufficient to break down the assumptions that you make. That I know for myself, what that really looked like was, my father died when I was 5. And at about the age of 30, I had a delayed grief reaction. And really what I was experiencing was the emotions of a 5-year-old who never really had the opportunity to grieve. And I had a lot of anger pent up in me, and that really actually changed everything for me. Once I had worked through that, began to understand it, about how I interacted with others, it opened me up to what I would call the world of spirit in a way that I had never been open before. So I think of, the phrase came to mind, sort of cracked open.
That's right.
And we sort of, so that gets back to what we were talking about before, about sort of the notion of suffering. It's hard, it's painful, but it's also opportunity.
I think it's necessary.
Well, it is necessary. I agree with you there. I think it is absolutely necessary, or else we just stagnate. And some of the most, I shouldn't say it like that, some of the most miserable people are the people who are afraid to face their own biographies, if I can put it that way.
Sure, yeah.
And so they would rather just shove it aside and be miserable. These are I shouldn't say it, they're the people who are bitter in old age. There's a bitterness there, and I think that's really difficult, and I'll just go on a bit of a tangent if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it was really interesting. My mom was 42 when she had me. I was the youngest. So my mom belonged to a generation of women who usually went from their familial home into their married life home.
Yeah.
And, so and one of the things I observed both with my mom, but with her friends, is that when they lost their partner, there was a real sadness, but there also was a sense of liberation.
Freedom. That word popped to mind.
Yeah. Because for the first time in their life, they feel like they're in charge of their life.
Yeah.
And I can still remember even my mom experiencing some of that, because my father was always, I've always said people with good intentions can do great harm. So he would always, apparently, from what I'm told from my siblings, surprise my mother, like go out and buy new living room furniture, which was a kind gesture, but it meant my mother never had the choice of being involved in that. And I remember the sense of satisfaction the first time she bought a couch of her own and she picked it out and paid for it herself.
Yeah.
And there was a real sense there of sort of accomplishment. So we have to go back in our biography to look at sort of what are the things that constrain us? What are the things that constrain our growth and development? And then we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we going to do about it? And that really comes back to what we were talking about, that you said the change really needs to come from within.
Yeah.
And, I've often said to many people, can't help anybody that doesn't want help, that doesn't want to change. And so they have to be ready to sort of engage in that struggle and that journey, whatever that journey looks like.
Well, change is difficult. And there's been changes that I've wanted to make, and it's taken me all my life to make those changes, even personality quirks. Just, it takes a lot of dedication. I remember talking about what it takes to make change, and I broke it down into steps, but invariably you'd have to go back to the first step every time, like repeatedly. And the first step was the consciousness that something has to change. And then in that consciousness, there has to be a willingness. So it's very difficult to just keep going back and saying, hold on, I want to make that change.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. This is sort of superficial, but I've just gone back to the gym this week after haven't been to the gym since before COVID. And the one thing I said is, I've got this brain in my head that still views me as being in my 20s without recognizing that it's making its way through life in a 67-year-old body.
Sure, yeah.
So really, and I can feel this when I get in the gym, that I want to do more, I want to do more, I want to do more. And I can't do more. And so really having to say, okay, it's okay to, what I say is I need to do age appropriate exercises as opposed to, there's that 25-year-old and he's pushing that much and I should be able to push. No, I shouldn't be able to push that much.
That's
but
right.
Part of it is recognition and acceptance.
Yeah.
And that's not easy. Especially when we got a 20-year-old, a brain that still thinks we're 20-year-olds unless we look in the mirror. Yeah. And so, but I think that's about that nature of change is so difficult, so challenging, so hard. And you're right. We have to break patterns. And it's interesting too, because context actually activates patterns of behavior. So, if you go into the gym, or I have a friend who's really worked hard, comes from a very dysfunctional environment, has worked hard to sort of break that down. But as soon as she goes home and gets back in that environment, she finds herself being drawn into the same behavioral patterns that have always been there. And she'll say, I thought I thought I'd move beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets back to what you say. It's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
And there's a lot of inertia that needs to be burnt out with change, and as soon as we go back and touch the old way, it's like flipping the switch back on and it's right up to full speed.
Yeah.
If that inertia hasn't burnt out.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's difficult. The idea that the changes we're going through, changes can often happen incrementally. Transformation, we can change parts of our life by changing assumptions. It could be, professional assumptions, could be personal assumptions we can make. Metamorphosis is an absolute change of worldview. It's a change of a way of understanding the world and our role and function and way of being in that world. So I've been trying to get my head around this idea of metamorphosis because I spend a lot of time thinking about transformation. And, it's, if you think about metamorphosis, and it's a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, and actually the neutral zone is the cocoon.
That's right.
And so it's an interesting way of thinking about it.
That acceptance piece, though, when you say that, it dings my mind because for me, acceptance is always a forward-moving action. Like we make this little action of acceptance, but in turn, it propels us forward into great leaps.
Yeah.
I was doing palliative care or hospice in the community one time for a gentleman, and he said, Dad, he goes, I can't accept that I'm going to die. And I said, well, we need to talk about that because if you can't accept it, you're going to fight to the end.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, what is it going to take? And I could identify that he had a buildup of things that he wouldn't and couldn't say over the years to his family and his children. And so I said, well, let's sit down and let's write some letters to your kids and your wife.
Yeah.
Because I felt like that was important for him to voice some of these things. And his ability not to accept had more to do with what he couldn't express.
Yeah.
And I could see that. I could see there was such a lack of expression of his true self that he needed to get that out. So we took that to task and I cued him. I asked him like 20, 30 questions about each family member and his wife. And by the end of that exercise, and thankfully we had enough time, all the letters were written and I was going to do his funeral. So I held the letters and dispersed them when he did pass. But when the last letter was written, he says, I can accept it now.
Yeah.
And the peace that came over him was just, it was profound. It had such an impact on me. And the connection that he and I developed over that time was so profound. And I remember going into Secure House right near the end, and I was about to leave because he asked me to come, and so I had a visit, and then I was about to leave, and I said, Bill, I love you. And he just sat there with a stiff upper lip. And I said, you old bugger, tell me you love me. Or actually, I used a little bit more profanity. And he almost sat up straight in the bed and said, I love you, I love you, I love. And his whole family was in the room, and they couldn't believe what they just saw because he had never said that to them. But we had built this connection and this bond that he could express that freely. And so that acceptance piece is a huge bridge that carries us a long ways. But so if we look at what we can accept and try to understand that,
Well, you remind me of when my mom died, and my mom was, she was born in 1914. So, Victorian, emotions were something that you didn't display. And I don't ever remember my mom saying, I love you until she was in her 80s and almost died a couple times. And that seemed to free up. And we used to talk a lot. And when she passed over, it was really, I was privileged to be there when she passed over. And there was just this calm peacefulness in the room, like business had been taken care of. My oldest brother died when he was 66. He had cancer. And I was with him when he died too. And Ray just never really accepted, in my opinion, that he was dying. And when he passed over, there was such a chaotic energy in that room. It was disturbing. And you could really feel that he didn't finish things.
Mm.
And so there was business left unfinished, I think. And that was, I think, part of his fight. So what you're saying with, that hospice care, I think it's so important for us to accept things. And mortality is one of the hard things. And, as it's interesting because I think a lot about mortality because I have fewer days ahead of me than I have behind me.
Yeah.
And what's important and what's not. And you're right. What are the things that are said and unsaid? And if you're not going to do them now, when are you going to do them?
Yeah.
And I think that can be very freeing. So yeah, I think you have great insight into this, Ned. I believe, and it's rooted in your experience. Which is the most valuable knowledge is the knowledge we derive from our experience. I love books. I read lots of books, but book learning has nothing over experiential learning.
That's right.
And that's where we do such a poor job with young people, even in with their schooling, about letting them draw on their experience. And that's part of it. We have an educational system that, from my perspective, again, that's not focused on people development. They're focused on labor development.
Yeah.
And so that humanity that used to be there in education isn't there anymore, I don't think. And it's not through the fault of teachers. I wouldn't be a teacher for all the tea in China.
Yeah.
But yeah, and maybe that's just a function of sort of our institutions growing increasingly dysfunctional, and
the model's outdated.
Yeah, the models are outdated. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about this world turning new and participating in it, and I keep coming back to that.
Yeah.
Because I think people can pull a lot of experience or things to try to later experience from this talk. One of the things that I think is really important, and it's a subject that I'm really trying to understand, and I've been contemplating this for a long time, and I'm not really far into my contemplation. I think there's just so much more for me to learn. But I've been talking about polarities and the masculine feminine polarity that lives within us, and that has nothing to do with gender. So I see as part of the new way of being in this world is understanding the polarities that we hold in ourselves. And you've touched on this while we're speaking about old ways of the masculine, male-dominated ways and how it squished out the feminine. And so in the world today, I see a need for the rise of the feminine, but I also see a need for the balance of the masculine.
Yeah.
Or for both those two polarities in ourselves to be balanced. And in that balance, I think we can find so much harmony in how to be. It's so in one of my books, Awakened, the Reality of What Is, I created these charts, and I'm still trying to really glean the information that is in these charts. So I talk about the in and out of balance of the feminine, the feminine, and in balance, it's creative, abundant. Out of balance is competitive and lacking, intuitive. Those is some of the language you're using. Loving, nurturing, flexible versus being stubborn. And with the masculine side, it's powerful. But when it's out of balance, it's forceful and dominant, determined and stubborn, and determined versus being stubborn and destructive.
Yeah.
So I'll bring these two charts up in the video, and if people want, they can pause it and just sort of look at the information that's here. But what are your thoughts about this? And please help me understand the work that I'm trying to do here.
I'm not sure I can do that, but Yeah, certainly sort of the polarity of the masculine and the feminine. When I was looking at your charts, the first thing that struck me is in Plato in his Republic, he talked about how we're a divided self and that we were once whole with masculine and feminine. We're divided into two, and then we spend the rest of our life looking for that other part of ourselves to sort of unite back in whole. And there's actually a Demi Moore movie years ago called The Butcher's Wife.
Okay.
Where she's seeking her soulmate. And we often think about sort of notion of soulmate as being another person, when in fact, maybe what it is that other half of ourself that has been lost. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that, Plato was talking about, the actual division. I think he was talking about the repression. And so I think from a societal point of view, the masculine has dominated. And we need the masculine in balance. So, and I looked at your charts in terms of enablement and those types of things. The difficulty is it's moved to a dissociated state, to that unbalanced, mm-hmm. and has repressed the feminine qualities. One of the things that when we talk about participatory consciousness, and I apologize, I'm going to use a philosophical term, but we operate in a world of an individual ontology, an individual way of being. And that individualism is now a hyper-individualism. Mm. And we've lost that relational component. What we really require is a balance between the individual ontology and the relational ontology. The relational is really related to the feminine. Mm. The connection. I often go back to think about, I can't even remember her name, Carol Gilligan's work on moral development. There's a theory of moral development that Lawrence Kohlberg talked about, and his whole theory was essentially based on a male sample. And Gilligan worked in his lab about how people make moral decisions. And he said, but what I don't really understand is females seem to be, and he used the word retarded in their moral development. Gilligan goes, no. Mm-hmm. We have different criteria by which we make moral decisions. And those ways those moral decisions are made are actually reflected in the different qualities and characteristics that you have in your chart. Mm. So what we need to do is find a cultural balance between the feminine and the masculine, which we do not have at this point. Mm. But we also need that within ourselves. And so we need to have that shift where we need to embrace the feminine as a valued partner to the masculine. And we need to find a way of bringing that integration, that wholeness, if you like, within ourselves and within the communities that we live in. Sorry, I'm touching the microphone. So you're going to get bump. And so those polarities are there, but how do we go about? And it's really about valuing and what we value. Mm-hmm. And we have such, I sound like a cynic, and I am a cynic, I guess. We have such distorted collective values, or no, I shouldn't say collective values, dominant values, mm-hmm. because those values, the dominance of those values is a product of a small cohort of individuals who have immense power. We could talk about the tech industry, or we could talk about any sort of industry really, or that. So but again, it comes back to how do people live their lives? How do we use these? How do we value them? And I think there's been some really interesting attempts to be made. But I think in your masculine chart, I think it was, you talked about one of the things in males when it becomes sort of dysfunctional is insecurity. Mm-hmm. When we're insecure, when men are insecure in their masculinity, they tend to overcompensate.
That's right.
And move from that, enablement piece over to that oppressive piece.
That's right.
And that. So it's interesting when you think about it. The bullies of the world are actually people who are really incredibly insecure and so need to act out because of their insecurity.
I've said that the closest friend of dominance is insecurity.
Yeah.
Before, in one of my quotes, talked about that.
Yeah. And females, the feminine side needs to embrace part of the masculine in order to express itself, to value what they have to say. And that I can remember, it's a short story, but at a faculty dinner one night, and our department chair was sitting there with his wife, and an election was coming up. And the department chair's wife turns to him, we're talking about politics, and turns to him and says, "And who will we be voting for this year?"
Yeah.
It's like, I just about died. You got to be kidding. Like, you're asking your husband who you should vote for.
Yeah.
And so there, I just use that as sort of an example of someone who's not articulating their voice and are dependent upon that masculine power to determine what they'll actually do. I don't know if I have any answers for you other than we need the feminine. I really like the psychology of Carl Jung, and he talks about the masculine and the feminine and sort of the bringing together. And I think the feminine's also associated with the soul, where the masculine tends to be associated with the spirit of ours. And we need both. We need a soul, we need a spirit, we need the masculine, we need the feminine. But how do we help people find their way to that? And we're in Western culture, we really don't. It's interesting, if you go to some of the more traditional cultures, they actually have that balance.
Well, and one thing I see in the world, and you touched on the topic of LGBTQ community, and sort of the undercurrent of their message is that we're so much more than this gender.
Yeah.
So again, that's understanding how irrational gender roles are, and how it's played a part in our behaviors and how we articulate ourselves, how we create, how we move into this world, and how it's stifled us.
Yeah.
And it's been such a stifling experience of adhering to a gender role. So that community is sort of pushing forward a message. I tattooed a transgender guy, and I said, "What does this mean?" Or he was non-binary. He sort of worked his way through these different transitions. And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, he basically started talking my language. He said, the basis of who I am is not tied up in my gender or this body. And I said, I say the same stuff, just in different language.
Yeah. I think what you're really pointing to is our propensity to want to put people in boxes. So we get a label, put it on somebody. Okay, I know that person because their identity is this, whatever that is, rather than actually getting to know them as a person. And I can remember talking to somebody who was very anti LGBTQ, and they were sort of ranting. I said, "How many people do you know?" "Well, none." "Then how do you know?"
How do you know? Exactly.
There's good people who are LGBTQ, and there's people you might not think are so good.
Yeah.
Just like, anybody.
That's
and
right.
so our propensity for putting people in boxes and labeling them and then thinking we understand them rather than actually getting to know them, to listen to them, to understand, again, their story. People have a need to tell their stories. And when we can't tell our stories, then we feel oppressed. And so, it comes back to stories again, I guess. And, you make some really valid points, I think, there, Ned, about that sort of give me pause to really think. And I think that's not something that we've talked about, but our issues of identity, and how change actually requires us to reconstruct or reconfigure our identity at times. You asked at the beginning whether you should call me Dr. Lauzon or not, and I said, no, call me Al. And why is that? And I think because I know lots of people who insist on being called doctor or professor or whatever, I think it's my identity of coming from working class. That's where I come from. I've always said, you can take the boy out of working class, but you can't take the working class out of the boy.
Yeah.
And so, I'm still the guy that worked the extruders at Dow Chemical. So identity issues, I think, are really important, but they can also limit us too. How do we begin to relate person to person in sort of a meaningful way without passing judgment? And we have a preponderance or propensity to judge people. Who am I to judge somebody else's journey? I honestly believe that for the most part, not everybody, but most people are doing the best that they can under the circumstances in which they live. It doesn't mean that we have to be open to learning. And in the absence of learning, growth gets stifled and eventually life loses its meaning.
Well, and that's the detrimental aspect to placing a judgment, a label, an assumption, or to think we know. And some of my greatest discoveries is my willingness to let go of what I don't, what I think I know, and to be curious enough to investigate, to look deeper. And that's been my greatest asset, is my curiosity. Because when I'm not curious and I think I know, it's the end of my learning.
Yeah.
And I've been talking about this a lot lately with clients. Don't assume you know anything.
Yeah.
What if we don't know what a door looks like? We would rediscover all the doors in the world, and there's just hundreds of thousands of them to take in.
As we grow and develop, we circle back and revisit issues from a new perspective.
Yeah.
So I've circled back many times on my dad's death and its implications. And each time I circle back, because I bring new life experience, new insights, new age, new understandings of me, the meaning of that event actually evolves and changes.
That's right.
So, the facts are the structure that we use, but the stories we tell is where the meaning resides.
And that's so true. I was being interviewed by Dr. Jeanette Gallagher one time, and I said that I constantly rehash the things that I think I know.
Yeah.
And she says, you do that because you change, Ned.
Yeah.
Your consciousness, each time you revisit these topics, your consciousness is different, and you'll find new things. And she says, I encourage you to continue doing that. And I never forgot what she said to me in that interview. Yeah. She's actually going to be on this podcast. I was interviewed by her, one of the best interviews I've ever had. And now she's going to be a guest on the show.
Oh,
so
excellent.
I look forward to poking some questions at her.
Yeah.
So lately I've been noticing there's more of an emphasis on nature in some of your social media posts. And I think nature has always been important to me. And I think that we've increasingly lost our connection to nature. What is the importance of nature to you, and why do you think we need it so badly?
Nature is very important. It's very important to the soul. It's very important to our health and well-being. And I had a colleague whose specialization was the environment and health and well-being. And Nate used to go to Europe to lecture to psychiatrists about how you should design hospital grounds and things. But I remember when I had my first hip surgery, and I was in recovery, I'm sure the nurses looked at me like I was daft. And so I'm laying in recovery looking out over this gray roof. And the nurse came by, and I said, you should really have gardens out there so that people who are laying in recovery see the gardens. And she looked at me like I was crazy. But we know that those natural environments actually foster healing. They foster both psychological and physical healing. Yeah. And you had raised that as part of that. And I think that's incredibly important. And some of my most profound moments of insights happen in the natural environment, not in my study, not.
That's right.
not in town, not in city, not in concrete, and letting the creation speak to you. The creation will speak to you if you learn to listen.
That's right.
But it requires you learn to listen. And that can be very profound and powerful, and insightful. The creation is the ultimate teacher. And there's much to be learned from it. And I'm intrigued with, I met this indigenous man from Norway who's been very involved in the idea of rewilding.
Okay.
I don't know if you know.
I've heard that term.
Yeah.
I think from you, possibly.
Oh, could be, yeah. And this notion of rewilding. And I think that's to be in that type of environment, to be in the natural world is just simply life enhancing, at least for me, and I think for most people. And we talked about youth and that, and this is, I guess this is a pet peeve for me right now. I had a very privileged childhood in the sense that I grew up around lots of natural areas. I grew up on Lake Huron. We had woods and wetlands behind us that I spent most of my time playing in. And I belong to a generation that you got kicked out of the house at 8:30, said come back for lunch, and then you got kicked out till dinner, and then you got kicked out till, it got dark.
That's right.
And children now don't play outside. Most of their activity is performance related. They don't have unstructured playtime. And as a result, kids don't understand risk or know how to take risks. And so when I was growing up, we took lots of stupid risks and sometimes we got hurt.
Yeah.
But we learned. And just being in the natural environment was just so empowering. I'm still drawn to it. One of the things when I was waiting for my surgery, and I haven't done that yet, I've been going to small walks and that, but there's some places I like to hike, and I need to get back to those places because they foster my well-being, they foster my health, and they help me hear the creation speak to me.
I think that's part of helping people find this new world that that is on the rise, is going back to nature and spending time in that. And from that, we glean this experience of the silence within, rising up quite naturally in those environments. So, Al, we've got up to a lot in this conversation.
Well, I hope it was useful. I'm not sure. I always feel like I'm rambling.
That's okay. It was useful for me.
Well, my students, when I used to teach, I would say something and they'd say, "Could you repeat that?" I'd go, "No."
Yeah,
I don't know what I said. What you sent out to me in the questions sort of gave me pause to really reflect. And I'm in a period of transition. I talk about sort of transitioning from, or changing or transforming from the fall of life into the winter of life. And the issues of retirement hit me a lot harder at the same time that I had some health crises that are really associated with aging. So sort of circling back on these things and trying to make sense of them. The other piece to that is, I have an increasing need for solitude. And I'm pretty solitude to begin with. That solitude is a really important part of the journey, particularly when you're sitting in that liminal space or the neutral space. Robert Keegan presented it as a helix. So we always circle back. And one of the things that he talked about that I think is really useful, he said, we operate in this tension between a need for autonomy and a need to belong. And that's what really fuels our development. So as we become increasingly individual, the tension to belong becomes greater until it pulls us back. And it actually leads to a spiral, and that really gets back to that inclusiveness. We move through ways of viewing the world that become more inclusive. And I'll just close on this. I know we've come to the end, but one of the things that he wrote a book called In Over Our Heads, And it's really interesting because part of what we didn't talk about is how we know and know, and different levels of consciousness bring about different ways of knowing the world. Mm. And he talked about how, a large percentage of the population from a way of knowing or a cognitive development frame aren't prepared to participate in the postmodern or in the modern world, let alone the postmodern world. Mm. And so part of it is how do we foster the development of that consciousness? And education does a very poor job of doing that. And we don't have the institutions. One of the things that I'm really interested in working on right now is the notion of eldering. So we have more old people than we've ever had, older people, I should say, and fewer elders. And part of it is we don't provide the supports for people to actually move from productive life to becoming an elder.
That is something that's very key. And as a young boy, I quite often found myself seeking the knowledge from elders around me.
Yeah.
And I've always found it so incredibly important to look to our elders to find answers. And then again, I have my own bearing, very strong bearing in life, and I'll take it back to myself. But without that knowledge from my elders, I wouldn't be where I am in my understanding. And, over 20 years ago, I bumped into you on the main street, and you had said you read one of my writing pieces, and you said, Ned, I said, I read your piece in the newspaper. I said, oh, what'd you think, Al? And you said, the writing was terrible.
Is that what I said?
Yeah, you said that. But you said, but Ned, you have a message. And I encourage you to continue to write. So now we fast forward well over 20 years. Mm-hmm. I want to say the same thing to you, Al. You're an incredibly intelligent and wise and just an awesome being. I want to tell you, keep writing, keep sharing, share what the things that you pull out of this quietude of yourself in these introverted times, continue to share it with us. We need it. We need you as an elder. And I can't begin to tell you how much I appreciate you.
Well, writing, like I said, writing is my way of understanding the world. I don't necessarily write formally as much as I do, although I'm trying to work on a couple books. But now that I'm through my surgery, what I need to find and what I'm trying to find right now is a rhythm for this new stage of life.
Thank you for taking time to listen. Stay tuned for our next episode of the You Matter podcast. Have a wonderful day.